Environmental organizations around the world are often stuck treating symptoms rather than addressing the root causes of environmental problems. Join author and naturalist Karen Shragg as we discuss how moving upstream could reinvigorate the environmental movement, today on The Population Factor. Environmental organizations around the world are working on 1,001 issues, but often they find themselves treating symptoms rather than addressing the root causes of those environmental problems. Today on The Population Factor, we look at a call to address root causes and reinvigorate the environmental movement. My guest today is Karen Shragg. She's an author, a naturalist, the longtime director of a nature center in Richfield, Minnesota, and she's the author of Move Upstream, A Call to Solve Overpopulation. Hello, Karen, and welcome to The Population Factor.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So your new book is called Move Upstream. Explain that concept of moving upstream.
Well, I live in Minnesota, and I have been to Itasca State Park, which is the headwaters of the Great Mississippi River. And I've actually been able to walk across the Mississippi River at its beginning. But I live in the greater Twin Cities metro area, where it's a raging river and full of dams and all kinds of activity. And it's where the flour mills got started. And the metaphor is that if you're going to try to fix something, start where they're just a trickle and start at the beginning rather than start where it's just everything is raging and you can't do very much about it.
So the idea here then is to address the underlying causes of our environmental problems. Let's talk about this concept in terms of the environmental issue that seems to be in the forefront of many people's minds, climate change. What would be a sort of a downstream solution to climate change?
Well, the first downstream solution is to believe that climate change is our only environmental problem.
Okay.
Our problems go far beyond climate change, but it's taking up all the bandwidth of environmental reporting.
So I agree with you on that, but I think you'd probably agree that climate change is one issue that we really need to address. So to get at this idea of upstream and downstream solutions, what are some of the downstream solutions that environmental groups are advocating for climate change?
Well, one solution that keeps being proposed are technological fixes and creating a lot more problems or different kinds of problems with technological fixes. And basically, when you use technology to solve a climate change problem, I think in the big picture, the upstream picture, you're really permitting us to continue doing what we're doing.
So the idea would be downstream solutions to climate change might be electric cars or
Right.
other really technological changes. Is the problem that they're not going to solve that problem, or is the problem that they're going to cause new problems?
Well, both. They're going to cause new problems because battery are very, very costly. Lithium mines, mostly in China, are extremely detrimental to local health as well as all kinds of other issues. I heard that you could drive a car with an internal combustion engine, for example, for 2 years for the energy it takes to make one car battery. But the bigger picture, the more upstream picture, Phil, to me, is that we are just looking to, when we turn on the lights, we want that source to come from somewhere else. It's like saying, one of my phrases I like to say is, we don't need green bulldozers. We need less bulldozers.
So I guess then from that perspective, moving upstream would be addressing the population issue. If you have fewer people, you're just going to need less electricity, less land to feed them, that kind of thing.
Exactly, exactly. Less is more.
So, it's a very interesting concept, and I'm really struck in the context of climate change by its intuitive appeal, but when you look in the policy realm, it's not being put forward. If you read the IPCC reports, the most recent ones came out in 2013, 2014, there were many hundreds of pages of technological solutions and ways to keep having more cars with less emissions, more electricity, less emissions, feed more people with less emissions. But I didn't see a call there for fewer people. It just wasn't in there.
I'm not surprised at all that they're coming up with these techno fixes. And because there's also the money factor, because there's money to be made in carbon capture technology, in wind turbines, in solar panels, all the things that we want to defer. There's dollar bills following that. There aren't dollar bills following less. Less people, to a lot of people, means less consumption because we're so economically driven to grow.
I think we might be getting at one of the impediments to moving upstream and addressing root causes of environmental issues. Those downstream techno fixes that you're talking about, putting them in place really doesn't mess too much with the general economic system that we have, which is based on growth. To address the upstream causes, population above all else, you can't necessarily make money out of it. It could slow down economic growth, slow down profits. So how do we address, as environmentalists, that problem? Is it a matter of convincing our fellow citizens that they can live better lives without growth?
I think we have to start with, you can live lives without growth. You cannot live there. You cannot make money on a dead planet. And I think that you cannot grow. You cannot live on a dead planet. There's no racial and social justice on a dead planet. And when I mean dead planet, I mean that thin layer biosphere that we all rely on. It's very, very fragile. And our stories that have gotten us to this place are killing it. So we have to back away from that because it won't work for anybody.
So in other words, even if it's difficult to move into a post-growth mind space, it's something we all have to work on.
There aren't options. And I don't think any of our, tiptoeing around the issue has gotten us anywhere. We've all been at this a very long time, and you can't say this, you can't say that. People are going to not like it, and we've done a lot of dancing, and we're still in a terrible place. So I think we have to be bold, we have to be truthful, and we have to say we're doing this for your benefit. I think that when you take agenda out of it, I think it gets listened to. I don't have an agenda other than to prevent suffering, misery, and early death.
So the message might not be you can just keep living an ever more wonderful life post-growth, but the message might be you'll be able to live a better life than the alternative of trying to push growth too far. Let's talk about another sort of upstream, downstream issue, and this is probably one that drives you crazy. We've got problems of malnutrition and even starvation around the world today. I've seen figures of 1.5 to 2 billion people who are not getting the proper nutrition that they need every day. And policymakers look at population projections and they say, okay, by the end of this century, we'll have to feed 10 to 12 billion people. And then they go on to talk about the downstream solutions to that. The upstream solution, I guess, would be to try to convince people to have smaller families. And yet I don't hear that as part of the discussion of feeding humanity. What do you think about that issue?
Well, I see something that sounds very harsh, and that's when you feed my starving children, you get more starving children. So I've had friends who have gone to Darfur in the height of its famine, and I asked them, who's your average customer. And this person's job was to hand a card to people to say when you got to eat. He didn't hand out food, just handed out a card. You could eat at 2 in the morning. You could eat at 4 in the morning. He said the average person was easy. It was a woman and her 4 children. And I said, let me ask you this. Did you do anything with birth control? Did you make that conditional on getting the food? And he said, oh, no. Our job was just to feed people. And I said, well, in that case, you better find some more food because next year she will come back with her 5th child. Not because she has a choice, but because she doesn't have a choice. And at a certain point, you run into that brick wall of we just ran out. Because in the production of food, you also have to ruin the climate. So it's all connected, and we have to be willing to say the truth, which is that we are an animal at the top of a food chain that just has gotten too successful.
Yeah, and I think that's a hard thing for people to wrap their minds around. And I can understand if you're talking about a famine relief effort, the number one priority there is to get people food. That's the natural, compassionate thing to want to do. But it's also compassionate to try to create a future where you don't have to keep giving starvation aid year after year. And when you look at the population projections around the world, it seems as if many of the countries that already have problems feeding and housing and taking care of their populations are the ones that are most likely to continue growing fast. So that's an issue right there.
And so much is cultural. So much is an inability to see the realities of how food gets to the plate, how much energy it costs to get there. And connecting to the land, I think, would be a huge, that's what I did as a naturalist, try to connect people to the cycles of nature, which are very slow cycles. And we move at such a rapid pace that we're outpacing nature's cycles. And so the idea that there will always be food in that cupboard is something that we are spoiled about.
So Karen, there's a paradox or a problem that a lot of us who are working on population have to deal with. On the one hand, we know that every child born has tremendous value. And those of us who have had children know this especially. But on the other hand, we're arguing that when it comes to children, like when it comes to anything else, you can have too much of a good thing. And I think that's a hard thing to think our way through. How do we make sense of that issue?
I think we have to realize that when it comes to children, we have more emotion than intellect involved, but we can play with that a lot. We can say, you love your children. If you want them to have any sort of future and a kind of life that maybe you had, life isn't getting better in an overcrowded, overconsumptive, overpopulated world. It's going to get worse. And the less people that have to struggle through that is better. So if you really love them, you're going to do the right thing. I have a friend who says, if you love your child, the best thing you can do is not give them a sibling. And that's a hard thing to say because we all have siblings that we wouldn't know what to do without. But on the other hand, now there's more food that's needed, more resources, there's less jobs, all the things that will not be available to those. So it's a hard lesson to do, but I do think we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
So that's suggesting that even though we're used to families with more than one child, we really can get used to one-child families. In your book, you say one-child families can save the world. So that's the kind of evolution, social evolution, that you're arguing we need to move in that direction.
Yes, I am.
So earlier you described yourself as a naturalist, and that's a sort of an old-fashioned word. So for some of our younger viewers, explain to us what a naturalist is.
We teach about how nature functions in the world and how we're part of that. My favorite line from a child was, I'm not a mammal, I'm a human. And that just shows you the anthropocentrism or the focus on humans, it gets into a child's brain very, very young. And it was our job to say, you can be a plant, you can be an animal, you can be a mineral. Those are your only three options. And you are an animal. And we're an animal at the top of the food chain. And as such, we depend on everything beneath us to support us. And that to me was the best lesson we ever taught. And also to give people the honest, real, scientifically proven answers of nature's cycles. I mean, there were so many myths we had to bust. The myth of infinite growth in a finite space is just one myth. How about the myth that you can't handle a baby bird or its mother won't come back to it? Or the myth that milk snakes actually milk cows.
Well, a lot of those myths have sort of deep roots, but it's interesting, even centuries ago when people maybe believed all kinds of unscientific things about the world, I think most people still had more of a connection to the natural world because that's simply where they were living. And you open your eyes and you see the way the world is. What sort of role has a connection to nature played in your own life, in your environmental advocacy? My sense is a lot of environmentalists today, younger ones, they come to environmentalism more through issues, especially big issues like climate change. I guess you came in a more personal way.
I would say so. Looking back at the time, I grew up in a suburb of Minnesota, but I grew up in a time where all my mom did was have to ring a bell, and she didn't know where I was. I was in a tree. So I connected in a very visceral way to nature.
So that's really what motivates your activism.
It does, because I call myself the Lorax. I speak for the trees.
Well, speaking for the trees and turning back to our population issue, what are some of the policy changes? What are some of the solutions to population growth or overpopulation that you'd like to see enacted?
Well, I think the number one thing is to have people understand that overpopulation is everyone's issue, every country's issue, but that it has to be dealt with locally. So I have the most chance of dealing with the issue in my local area and with policies that start out with zoning and start out with, are we going to allow high rises to come in and so on. And then the I word, immigration. Immigration can easily bulldoze whatever small family mantra that you've been talking about, because people who are, and they don't even have to be desperate, they just see a better life here, or their cousins here, or they see a better world.
Sure.
They want to come to the US, and I'm a granddaughter of an immigrant, and I understand that motivation. But at a certain time, how are we going to solve the world's problems when you keep thinking that you're going to take the 80 million people are added to the world every year? If we take in 1 million, that's 1/80th of the people that have just been added. So we not only haven't we helped a problem, we've made our problems here worse.
But what would you say to someone who said, okay, I understand that there's an environmental cost to growing populations, to bringing in more immigrants, let's say, but we're talking about people who could radically improve their lives.
Well, yes, but where's your denominator? They can improve their lives while kind of ratcheting down the lives of people already here in the United States, meaning that we have to divide the pie ever thinner, and their slice of the pie would be better than the slice they already have, but it would make the slice here even worse. And I like to focus on resources, because even with intermigration, you're seeing a lot of people moving to the Southwest, which is water scarce already. How can more people be the answer to that? And if we're growing by migration, then that's where our levers are to stop the train from crashing.
And of course, as a naturalist, you'd also probably want to bring in the issue of justice for other species. I mean, we typically tend to talk about this in terms of our interests and would-be immigrants' interests, but there's also the question of other species being displaced. How far do we want to push that, and are we willing to push that other species up to and over the brink of extinction.
That's what's really important when you talk about wildlife. I can't assume that people have the passion for wildlife that I do. I focus on the quality of life and the ability to live. All those things are connected to how many people are needing limited resources. All of those issues. I tend not to focus on wildlife, though, because they're going, oh, who cares about a snail darter?
Well, I was asking earlier, where are you coming from on these issues? I think there's a really nice way to state that, and it's at the end of your book. I was going to ask you if you'd be willing to read the poem from the last page of Move Upstream. Could you do that?
I sure could. So are you talking about tick, tick, tick? That
yes,
one?
Yes.
Okay. Tick, tick, tick. Every second, the sound of new passengers added to our spaceship, long past being able to sustain them. Work at the problem source, where the stream begins just to trickle. Tick, tick, tick. It takes courage to work upstream and stay there when the world is pushing us further down, to focus on cures instead of causes, at results instead of actions. Tick, tick, tick. It takes wisdom to know that all will be futile if we don't work at the source and expose our futile paradigm. For possibility lives and justice resides when we start to get the numbers matter. That growth is the ideology of a cancer cell on a planet that was never limitless, except in ignorance, perhaps in creativity. Tick, tick, tick. Don't let them tell you you don't have a heart. And this is when I cry, because you work upstream. For as the wizard had to show the Tin Man, those who work upstream have always had the biggest hearts of all.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I love that poem, and I'd encourage people to take a look at your book, Move Upstream. It's short, but I can't think of a better introduction to population issues. So it really is a wonderful, wonderful book. On that note, Karen Shragg, I'd like to thank you for being my guest today on The Population Factor. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's been a real pleasure.